Southern cornbread dressing is a classic side dish for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Sunday dinner. Although it looks kind of intimidating, learning how to make cornbread dressing is actually really easy. Although you could use pretty much any type of bread to make dressing or stuffing, in the southern United States, it's really traditional to make a dressing that's based on cornbread. I always use traditional skillet cornbread, but you could definitely use a mix or store-bought cornbread if you want. However, a lot of southern cooks will tell you that you do not want to use a sweet cornbread to make homemade dressing. So if you use a mix, make sure that you get one without any added sugar or just a minimal amount of added sugar. In addition to the cornbread, most traditional southern recipes include some other type of bread as well, usually white bread. But I have heard of people using biscuits as well. The key with the bread is making sure that it's dry so that it absorbs the liquid. So I always make my cornbread the night before, and the white bread I toast it. Not all recipes for cornbread are the same, and not all slices of bread are the same size, so it's kind of hard for me to tell you exactly how much to use. Since the first step in making cornbread dressing from scratch is crumbling up the cornbread and slicing or tearing up the white bread, I'm going to do that, and then I'll measure how much I used so that I can give you an idea of how much you'll need for a 9 by 13 dish of dressing. I used half of my cornbread recipe, about 350 grams. I would say 2 3/4 of a cup of crumbled cornbread, and I used 6 slices of white bread, about 130 grams. Now I'm going to add the meat. You could make a vegetarian cornbread dressing, but traditionally people usually add meat. It could be breakfast sausage, but usually it's either chicken, like I'm doing now, or giblets. If you're unfamiliar with giblets, they are the internal organs of the poultry, the heart, the liver, etc. If you buy a whole chicken or turkey, the giblets are usually in a white envelope inside of the cavity. Southern cornbread dressing is a very common side dish for Thanksgiving. So what a lot of people do is that while the turkey is roasting in the oven, they will boil the giblets on top of the stove. And once the meat is cooked, they will chop it up and then add it to the dressing. Or some people add the giblet meat to gravy. Even though I usually do add the giblets to my dressing, for some reason my chicken did not have the giblets. Their taste is a bit different from normal meat, so if you're feeling a bit unsure, you could definitely just cook some chicken and add that to the dressing. After adding about a cup of chicken, I then added 2 celery stalks and half of a medium onion that I sauteed in butter and canola oil. The next 2 steps in making a southern cornbread dressing recipe are the most important: adding the stock and then the spices. Although you could definitely use store-bought stock, I highly recommend making your own, because as with everything, homemade is better. What I'm going to do now is I am going to add the stock. Here I have about a cup, and I am going to add it to the dressing until it is sufficiently moistened. Knowing exactly how much stock to add is probably one of the most ambiguous and most difficult parts of making southern cornbread dressing. You want to add your liquid until it's just at the point where you say, that might be too much. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but since the dressing is going to cook in the oven, the heat is going to cause some of the liquid to evaporate. That's why if your dressing goes in dry, it's going to come out even drier. However, if it's too wet, then the dressing will never cook through. So if you're making cornbread dressing for the first time, I recommend that you add the stock half a cup to 1 cup at a time. mixing thoroughly and then waiting maybe 30 to 60 seconds before adding more. It takes time for the bread to absorb the mixture, so it's important to add the liquid slowly so that you don't accidentally add too much. I've been stirring my cornbread dressing for a few minutes, and as you can see, the stock is pretty much absorbed. And at this point, it looks almost like I added just a bit too much stock. That's what you want. This is right about where you want it. You want it at the point where it looks like I might have just added just a little bit too much. That is perfect. Although knowing how much stock to add to the dressing is really important, knowing how much seasoning to add is just as important. Dressing and stuffing has a lot of bread, so just like other casseroles, you're going to add more spices than you think. However, specifically with Southern cornbread dressing, there are certain spices that are very strong. The salt, pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder are strong, but they're relatively forgiving. But on the other hand, the poultry seasoning and sage are not. Especially the sage, which comes in two varieties. Ground sage, which is a fine powder, and rub sage, which is little stems. I'm using rubbed sage, the little stems, but if you use ground sage, the fine powder, you're probably going to add a little bit less. Some people don't care for sage at all, so if you want to leave it out or just use a pinch, I think that would be okay. Because if you accidentally add too much sage, your dressing will be bitter. Starting off with half a teaspoon of each spice. And just to be clear, this is what I call half a teaspoon of sage. Like I said, a little goes a long way. I just finished adding in the spices to my Southern cornbread dressing. I did a full teaspoon each of all the spices. I honestly think if you've never made this before, maybe half a teaspoon each would have been fine, but I like everything to be very flavorful. One thing I did want to point out is I did not add any more chicken stock, but look, the bread has continued absorbing it, and like I said, I think I added just the right amount. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add 2 eggs just to make sure that everything holds together so that I can cut it nicely. And then I'm going to cook this in the oven. I baked my dressing at 350 covered for 30 minutes and then 350 uncovered for 30 minutes. I was really excited about my dressing because I usually only make it about once a year, so I couldn't wait to dig in. Honestly, my Southern cornbread dressing recipe turned out great. The flavors were perfectly balanced, and even though I could definitely tell that there was poultry seasoning and sage in this dressing, they weren't overpowering. The chicken stock added a ton of flavor and moisture as well, and in my opinion, I think that using a brown stock really made this special. The shredded chicken was a great addition as well, so even though I used this dressing as a Thanksgiving side dish, I think you could definitely make this a main dish if you wanted to as well. And even without the giblets, it was still delicious. In addition to the flavor, I really liked the texture as well. The top was nice and crispy, and the inside was soft and moist. Like I said earlier in the video, I think that one of the hardest, if not the hardest parts of making a Southern cornbread dressing recipe is adding just the right amount of stock. And as you can see, even though while I was making the dressing, it looked like I may have added a bit too much stock, it actually turned out perfectly. Although this dressing is great on its own, I usually serve it with the roast chicken, and I use the drippings from the chicken as a type of gravy. And of course, you can't have cornbread dressing without some cranberry sauce. Southern cornbread dressing is the perfect Thanksgiving or Christmas side dish. So be sure to give this recipe a try. As always, thanks for watching. Bye!